Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Wire App. I'm Jahnavi Sen. Just this morning, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Donald Trump have both spoken on social media about how India-US trade talks are going to be resumed, and the two will even be talking to each other soon. However, this comes at the same time as Trump apparently having asked European Union officials to impose a 100% tariff on both India and China as a way to put pressure on Russia and its President Vladimir Putin. Questions around whether the Indian government is doing enough to safeguard domestic producers and markets at this time of global uncertainty remain. Meanwhile, the last 3 days have seen massive upheaval in Nepal. Protests on Monday around unemployment, corruption, allegations of corruption, and a social media ban ordered by the government were met with brutal repression, and 19 protesters were killed in police firing. The next day, protests escalated and changed nature entirely, with protesters burning down government buildings and storming them. And the Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli has resigned and fled. We will be talking about all of this, and with me to discuss it, I have Deepanshu Mohan, who's an economist at OP Jindal Global University, and MK Venu, who's founding editor of The Wire. Thank you both for joining me. If we start with what's going on in the Indian economy and also with the India-US trade talks. Now, we had been seeing basically a stalemate for the last several weeks, even though there were kind of mixed signals coming from India and the US. Some Indian ministers and officials were saying that talks are perhaps still continuing, but Trump and his advisors were speaking quite antagonistically about India in terms of calling it a laundromat for Russian oil and currency and things like that. Now, early this morning is the first time Trump has actually said something positive in a while, and immediately Prime Minister Narendra Modi has responded, saying that he's looking forward to taking India-US relations further at this time. But ironically, as I said earlier, this comes the same day as news reports saying that he spoke to officials from the European Union yesterday who were in Washington to discuss the situation in Ukraine, and said that it would be good if the EU decided to levy a 100% tariff on India and China as a way to put pressure on Russia. Now, the EU has not suggested it's going to do anything of that sort, but this coming from Trump the same day he has posted about how he's very much looking to speaking to his very good friend Modi does raise some questions. Now, we've known for some time now that this is a period of great economic and geopolitical uncertainty across the world, and also repositioning in some ways. The US's increasingly antagonistic stance towards India has been clear over the last several months. We've seen the way advisors have been speaking about India's trade dealings, its tariffs, and so on. Some of the moves that the Indian government has made recently, including the GST reforms, which it has redone the slabs. Now there are only two at 5% and 18%, might be an attempt to try and sort of change the impact of what we're seeing happening. But questions around the overall health of the economy still remain. Deepanshu, if I could start with, you've written recently about how celebrations around the 7.8% GDP growth rate are perhaps not really understanding the full picture, and these numbers are masking the true health of the Indian economy. What do you see happening today?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me here. Always a pleasure. Uh, so I would probably start by observing or sharing two particular points on the broader state of the health of the economy. One is the lack or the perhaps inability of the government to sufficiently be able to crowd in enough domestic private investment in the economy. I mean, this clearly, as a matter of policy, all kinds of interventions have been tried, attempted. But if you look at the last 10 years, pretty much anytime post 2016 onwards, demonetization, the numbers have not looked at any point of time sort of moving at a higher order. That puts a lot of pressure on two things. First, you have then a lot of pressure on fiscal spending by the government, which it was correct for a period of time to maybe prioritize on capital expenditure, make infrastructure its priority, ensure for logistics, get the supply chain cycle moving. But what the hope was that it would then allow for domestic private investment to pick up. It was all happening at a time when the MSME sector, has been struggling since 2016. Some of us have been writing about this, that the main job creation that happens in the Indian industrial landscape, outside what you see in high value added services and let's say in construction work, is in the MSME space, and that space has been struggling. Most symbolic interventions that the government has made, including during the pandemic, were on very minor monetary policy adjustments, which you can hardly see as part of fiscal policy correction. They did have for 1 year or 2 years some credit guarantees, government backed guarantees. But the idea was that this should have ideally been extended because the MSME space was struggling. My sense was that over the last few years, MSME, particularly aligned to exports, like in textiles and apparel, was regaining some ground. A lot of those orders were linked to its demand with the US. You see that impact now being experienced because of the cancellation of orders. So you have jobs lost at a time when jobs are not being sufficiently created. So we are not at all in any way able to grow at a pace which is sustainable for the kind of expectations India's economy has for its own citizens. And any numbers that would tell you that yes, India is comparatively growing at over 7% or 7.5%, it needs to be seen in a perspective of what is your optimal capacity to grow. I think the word capacity, or what in technical terms we call as production possibility, uh, is to be explored in reference to across what sectors can do. And I think there we can clearly see that India's analytical robustness in the growth composition is very limited to very few sectors doing a lot more. And there is, at the same time, a huge capital divide between what you would consider as oligarchic big capital investors. They are clearly putting a lot of money on purchasing of assets, diluting those, but you don't see a lot of that having beyond that unit of investors. The other big thing is of the change you're seeing in portfolio investment. Now, either the government can put more money to crowd private investment in, or you can allow for greater foreign uh, direct investment into the country. You see the numbers, and FDI numbers are not very great. In fact, one of the states which have received the maximum FDI is Tamil Nadu, has perhaps given a very good model for the country to boost manufacturing in areas where FDI investment is potentially possible. But beyond Tamil Nadu and a few states, Andhra and maybe partially Telangana, the FDI net flows have been more or less negative, which means that most of your foreign investment is portfolio investment dependent. That we in economics often call as hot money. It can come and go off very quickly. It can cause a lot of exposure on your rupee, which is clearly is the case. You're seeing that now happening over the last few years. So it leaves very little options for the government. So we do need a good partnership with the US because we're more vulnerable for dependence on FDI. We're more vulnerable for the orders that we are trying to do and build. And at the same time, you have a very volatile and uncertain global market scenario. So the only way India can actually focus on its own growth trajectory is to look at reforms which are actually applicable for low middle income groups. So the maximum you've seen in that reference in the last few months is the GST rationalization story. And I was arguing this recently, that GST rationalization by its own very nature is an important step. It was long overdue, but will not help cut the squeeze on the middle class, because most of your middle class is saving much less now and is entirely trapped in a higher debt cycle. And you see the numbers on household debt and you'll get a picture. Is it that bad? Not really. Is it a lost time? I would not say so. But I think we are not understanding the problem from a domestic perspective well enough to be actually able to correct this. And that's my concern, is principally that.
You know, the finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, she has responded to those who are saying that the GST rationalization is a response to what's happening with the US tariffs, as saying that it's unrelated and this is something the government has been considering and working on for a while. Uh, whether that be the case or not. I mean, there are definitely questions around that given the exact timing of when this has happened. And it's true that this has been a demand for a long time. So then that brings the timing into question even more. But Venu, especially given how we've seen that, the US tariffs are hitting particularly labor intensive sectors.
Yeah.
Is what the government doing enough? Is it doing anything in your eyes?
Well, the only move so far in response to Trump tariffs, I I personally believe that the fast tracking of GST is a response to Trump tariff, and some ministers are also saying it that we are doing enough. They're talking about GST rationalization as part of response to safeguard the economy. So, but GST reforms alone will not help. She's also said that they have a plan to ring fence the labor intensive sectors and uh, provide some relief to MSMEs, as Deepanshu said. MSMEs are very badly hit, right? So, and most of these sectors are in the MSME, whether it's gems and jewelry, fisheries, or footwear, leather, textile, etc. So, I have not seen anything concrete announced for those sectors so far. In fact, recently I was quite struck by a suggestion that Raghuram Rajan made in an interview, slightly out of the box kind of suggestion, idea. He said if some big corporations, as he said, oligarchs, have made super profits on account of cheap Russian crude, why doesn't government create a framework where some of those profits are, redirected to these very vulnerable sectors? Yeah. Now, decent idea. In fact, I also made that suggestion in one of our videos. In fact, on the same day as Raghuram Rajan. So now, will the government think of something like that? I don't see any out of the box thinking on those lines coming to ring fence these sectors. My sense is that, as you said, the talks have resumed. So there is, these guys are just hoping. And a statement from Piyush Goyal came about a week ago that he hopes to conclude negotiations by November. It was a very, very definitive statement. So why November is something that puzzled me, because talks have already happened. We've had already 5 rounds. And my information is that an interim package was sent to the US. It was also accepted by Trump's advisors, but when it went to Trump's table, it got rejected. Now, my understanding that the interim package was about India reducing duties quite drastically in the manufacturing sector, maybe to a single digit actually, because currently, India charges about 15% average tariff on manufacturing. US is at about, I think, 2.5-3%. So one of the demands is that it should be aligned closer. So that was not accepted. Manufacturing was not accepted for obvious reasons. Trump wanted agriculture sector to be opened. Prime Minister said, no, we can't open up Indian agriculture, especially to GM crops, etc. And PM is also on record that he will personally pay the price to protect the farmer. Now, since the talks have resumed, I don't know what they will again go back to agriculture sector. So what position will India take? That's a question mark. But I'm sure that the manufacturing sector tariffs will be reduced quite dramatically by November or whatever, December, when talks conclude. And if in the meanwhile, if Trump can suspend his other demands, like you said, European Union wanting European Union to put 100% tax, that cannot happen because India is in the process of negotiating a very robust FTA with the European Union on the lines it did with UK. So, in fact, India has already created some other leverages against the US. So, India is trying to talk to European Union. They're trying to negotiate with the South African, customs union, Gulf countries for a more robust, free trade agreement, so that Indian exports can be diversified away from the. It is possible. By the way, Indian textiles can be refashioned to to say sell to China. If you have a deal with China, for instance, China is a huge consumer. China can take or the African countries or Latin American, EU can take a lot of Indian stuff, labor intensive textiles, leather, etc. So I think the US is becoming a bit paranoid about those possibilities. So therefore they are back to the table, and of course the big elephant in the room is the Russian oil. Now my personal belief is that the arbitrage on Russian oil is now, I'm told, reduced to about $3 or $4. It's not the same as it used to be. The discounts earlier were average $11 per barrel, for many years after Ukraine. So if that is the case, if there is commercial viability to, if India is not gaining a great deal by importing Russian crude, India can really bring down its purchase of the share of Russian crude in India's total purchases from 37 odd percent to, if we can go down to easily about 15 odd percent, 10%. I think
similar to what it was before.
yeah, no, before it was 1%. So that is the problem that the US has. So to some extent, I mean, they have numbers on their side. They are saying that India went up from 1% of Russian crude in their basket to 37, 40%, whereas China went from 13 to 16%. So their claim is, which Scott Bessent also said publicly, that China hasn't incrementally sort of gone that high buying, So their problem is that India has gone up from 1 to, it's a huge leap, That I think can come down if you all agree that it is just benefiting a few bloody large companies, even if it is $4, it's still benefiting some large companies. I think that we can that should not, in my view, should not be a problem, and I think the government could be looking at reducing the the share of Russian crude, and I'm sure Modi will be able to explain it to Putin in the larger interest of global South. Should be a possibility. Yeah. As for the overall economy, I think we are still in a crisis because, as Deepanshu said, no investments are coming. Even less investments, private investment would be forthcoming as long as this uncertainty lasts. Because time is of the essence. People don't have patience these days. You can't negotiate for 6-7 months. The investors will not invest. They'll wait for the outcome of the talks. So let's hope I think November is too long a period. My sense is that Piyush Goyal mentioned November because of Bihar elections. By then, Bihar elections will be over. And one of the big issues in the opening of agriculture was corn, GM corn, maize. Bihar is one of the largest producers of maize. So there are a lot of political economy kind of complications. So, but I think we are losing time. We are losing time, and investments take a long time to come back. So if people postpone their decision to invest, and the 7.8% growth that we saw in this quarter could also be because the real impact of 50% kicks in actually post August, isn't it?
August 27th.
Yeah, after. So I don't know, the next 2 quarters, April, May, June was reasonably okay, but between, say, July to December, I think we'll be in a bad shape. That's my assessment. Yeah.
No, so the 2 points I would probably say is, so on tariffs impacting the Indian growth story, I would probably say that because it is the seasonality of consumption demand peak in October and November, which are the months where you see maximum consumption demand, it's Diwali, there's a lot of spending that happens. I mean, the GST rationalization, my sense was of 2 reasons. One, you're getting into the peaks consumer demand season for consumer durables. And second, you have the Bihar elections coming up. So low middle income class really matters, because if you see the rationalization of slabs, a lot of the luxury goods, you don't expect that to be consumed from the average consumer in Bihar, who is generally representing of the low middle income or middle income group. The second point, which is on the Russian oil arbitrage or the impact of that. So I personally don't envisage much change. I think India will continue purchasing oil from where it gets best possible price. They'll stick on that position. I think Jaishankar gave a very good hint in that effect, which is that the Russian oil purchase dynamics was never part of the discussions on trade with the US administration, and that still would remain so. I think there are some compromises in agricultural sector that you may see happening. To what extent these are subtle changes versus sudden drastic measures, I think that needs to be looked at. But one also has to ask the larger question: why I mean, after 10 to 11 years of a government being in power with almost being in a majority, why is the agricultural sector struggling so much still? I mean, if you talk about Prime Minister Modi's promise to the farming community, forget about farming incomes being doubled. If you look at the state of fertilizer subsidies or just the cost to farming, the average cost of farming now has almost doubled for farmers. If you were to take cases of the MSP pricing disbursements for those in Haryana, Punjab, I mean, the whole Kisan Andolan exposed the government's vulnerability of dealing with farmers. So you may anticipate a greater, and South Asia is seeing a lot of violent protests right now. We have been fortunate that one of the largest farmer protest movements that you've seen in recent years was mostly very, very peaceful in that sense. But the next time around, when you see that amount of resistance coming, what one doesn't know really how things play out. The government clearly has, in my understanding, lost the will and capacity to do major structural reform. It lost out on a golden window. Now you will see tinkering of reforms, GST rationalization, some amount of tax credit, maybe in the union budget on direct tax reforms because they've made a lot of changes in the tax code. There's a huge middle class tax burden now. So if you're not getting hit on the indirect tax side, you will get hit enough on the direct tax end as well. So combined effect of all these, you will see that this will be not well received. On agriculture, I feel that whether you talk about land or engaged reforms, the only way to do it through consensus building with states. And the one biggest flailing of this administration in India over the last 10 years is it's lost trust and compact with states. And I think till that is not fixed or addressed, till you don't go back to consensus building with states, 17 to 18 states in India have to grow at double digits, period, for India to grow optimally at purse production. This is a statement coming from Avan Panagria, who has been head of the Finance Commission. He's very clearly saying that 17 states have to grow at double digits. Right now, there are 3 or 4 states. And you'll see those 3 or 4 states, and they are mostly states which are not being governed by the ruling party at the helm at the national level. And the ruling party at the national level has done everything possible to make things difficult for state governments which are not from the ruling party.
Yeah, that's why
So
there were
how
even
do
doubts raised after the GST rationalization of states
exactly?
saying,
So how do you anticipate
yeah.
without that trust? I mean, the US is not the only one who's lost India's trust, or India is not the only one who's lost the American trust. Are we trusting our own states to grow at the level that they can? Are we understanding their comparative advantages in the areas that they are doing very well? I don't think so. I think we've not really invested that much of thinking capital. The focus has been a lot on centralization, a lot around politicization of national security, of numbers. There is mainstreaming of a certain kind of jingoism in media where GST rationalization is announced and you make a whole news sort of circle that this is the sort of biggest reform that you can anticipate. Anybody and everybody knows this is just basic minor tax
Yeah.
readjustment. There's nothing that you're going to achieve out of a minor step like that. So I think we have to look at the larger story somewhere. I think the political economy dynamics in the Indian context right now is of a weak state capacity. It is of a political will which is not consensus building enough. It has a tendency to work a lot times in the dark. uh, Parliamentary proceedings give us that evidence, and you are not able to have reform, and anything you do at a macro level will not change the micro realities of the lived experiences of most workers, which is why you have now entitlement based reforms where you're giving cash transfers of 15,000, 10,000, and I would be surprised how much you can
Even
sustain
those
this.
are not being
Actually moved on.
Maharashtra,
Yeah.
they announced it. They won the election. Then they they started sort of,
So that raises questions around the fiscal
because they
policy.
don't have the money, so
Fiscal policy and
even in
fiscal
Madhya Pradesh,
numbers
I
will
think
not have.
the cash transfers that they announced, they went back on some of the components. Yeah. The state, it's very fascinating if you read the book that former finance secretary just wrote, No Minister, Subhash Garg. We interviewed him. We came on the wire. I spoke to him. His book clearly says that in one of the meetings relating to 10th Finance Commission transfer, he actually says on record in that book that the PMO note comes and says the 10th Financial Commission transfers also should be determined on the basis of our vision, centralized, whereas 10th Finance Commission transfers are totally unconditional. Yeah. It goes to the states and they'll do what. Even on those, the PMO note says that we have to impose conditions, we have to push our centralized vision onto the states. And where Mr. Subhash Garg says, raises this question in one of the meetings, he says that how can you do this? Because it goes against the federal principles, that we have to follow in the 10th Finance Commission operation transfers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, as Venu said, Piyush Goyal has given this November deadline, and since today, Modi and Trump have announced that they're going to resume talks. We are going to see what's going to at least happen on that side, but overall, the questions you've raised about the health of the economy, particularly, the relationship with the states, has been a long-standing issue much before the tariff concerns were raised. And those are issues that will persist even if the headlines do revolve around these very immediate and perhaps rather low-stakes decisions that are made. Moving on to the other thing we wanted to discuss today, which is what we've been seeing in Nepal over the last 3 days. So it has been a very extreme upheaval. We saw protests break out on Monday. These were led largely and joined largely by the youth or Gen Z. The immediate trigger was a ban on 26 social media websites and applications. But the issues they were raising were much more widespread around allegations of corruption in the ruling elite, unemployment, the lack of domestic job opportunities, and the way the government responded was perhaps intended to really get people's backs up. Police firing on protesters that led to 19 deaths. It's a very high number. And while by the end of the day, the Home Minister had resigned and the social media ban had been revoked, what had been unleashed was then perhaps out of anyone's control, because the next day we saw how the protests escalated to a much wider degree. Perhaps even the nature of the protesters changed. It was no longer necessarily only Gen Z out on the streets. And there were buildings on fire. There were houses being ransacked, Parliament building, Supreme Court also being burnt. And we saw, the Prime Minister had to resign. He fled. Several ministers in his cabinet as well. The army stepped in to...
Where is he fled? I mean, is there any news on where is he gone? No, we don't know. Although the student leaders are saying that they're warning or they're telling India that don't do what you did with Hasina.
With Sheikh Hasina.
Yeah, Sheikh Hasina. Please don't give these people any,
Yeah. So the army has stepped in. A curfew has been imposed indefinitely at the moment. And I guess we're going to have to see how the situation unfolds, because the anger did seem like it was directed across party lines, not only at the ruling regime, but at the
political class.
Yeah, at the ruling elite as a whole. And they were all seen as responsible for the situation in the country. And the roots of this protest, as we were talking about, are economic. The lack of job opportunities. In 2024, 33% of Nepal's GDP came from remittances. That's a very high amount. We've seen the number of people asking for work permits to work abroad. It's very, very high in Nepal. Unemployment is above 20%. So I wanted to ask both of you,
unemployment is
even higher. So how do you read what we have seen over the last few days?
Okay, I'll give you 2-3 interesting things. One is that the nature of the politics in Nepal, there was utter cynicism, which broadly cynicism among the people, especially the youth, about the way the political system was being run. So it's very odd. Since 2015, when the constitution Nepal got got a proper constitution, became a republic, and then since then you see the way it has been ruled. Uh, this coalition parties, they are, and their leaders, Prachanda, uh, KP Sharma Oli, and then Sher Bahadur. Uh, they've been taking turns, and they've. I was just trying to see their the the chronology. Nobody has stayed for more than 1 year, max 1.5 years. But it's been like a revolving door. One goes, the second comes, and third, second goes, third, then the first one comes again. So and then the corruption. I read about how the Boeing deal commissions having been paid to politicians, and very interesting. Oli Sharma's slogan. Uh, it kind of echoes some slogans here. Na khaunga na khane dunga. Basically, he said that I won't make money and won't let others make money. And then and stuff like that, and all kinds of promises, but no delivery. No. Although Nepal has shown some growth rate, but I think the the growth has probably been very skewed, and the youth hasn't really benefited in terms of more broad-based
And is
employment.
it likely to be remittance driven, do you think?
There's some data that on a population base of 28 odd million, a inordinately large number of people were leaving the country every year. I think 400,000. It's a big number. 400,000 on a base of leaving every year. It's huge.
And huge in Southeast Asia, actually.
Huh?
There's a huge exodus of Nepalese in Southeast
Yeah,
Asia.
yeah. So
Earlier, it was in Europe and transatlantic sort of belt, but a lot of that is now in the Southeast Asian.
So there is a political economy serious. There are many issues there, and the system was not delivering. The system was not giving agency or confidence to the. But nobody anticipated this, and it really came out of the blue. So similar to what happened in Sri Lanka, perhaps, or even Bangladesh. So one
But
doesn't know
perhaps
whether.
even much faster, just.
Yeah, much faster. Yeah, and I think youth unemployment and corruption. These are two issues plaguing most societies in this region, including ours. We've not had at an all India level, but at different times we've had this issue. Like the 2024 UP election had stunned the BJP. And similarly, regionally we have seen this playing out. Yeah.
No, so I mean, my observations of what you're seeing in Nepal perhaps would be summed up in the context of when you've generally seen that democratic structures in appearance and form and structure turn to actualize themselves as illiberal formations. The first major impact you see is in the breakdown of trust between the citizenry and the state. Second, you would see is that a lot of the trust breakdown is because of the lack of transparency, which is what fuels corruption and maximally a lot of rent seeking behavior. I think sometimes corruption gets blurred in terms of understanding how rent seeking attitudes work. Sometimes politicians do not engage directly in corrupt practices, but they create enough conditions in the market and also through policy that there is what you consider as a collusion between big capital, big business, and the state. I think a lot of that is deeply entrenched in the South Asian canvas. I would not deny that India is anyway too different or outside that prism. There is clearly now within contracting systems between state governments and contractors some kind of understanding of what money needs to be given for tenders, and a lot of that practice fuels in. So trust, transparency is important. Well, the third thing which I think this category of the Gen Z requires, I think, a lot more of work in terms of, and this is happening in social science. We're trying to now understand youth aspiration in a very different way because technology, access to social media, and what you would consider as an internationalized global knowledge information order It's changing the expectations and aspirations, which is bringing the third T, which is tangible outcomes. Nobody would be happy unless you're not seeing tangible returns, whether it is in terms of material gain, whether it is in terms of jobs, whether it is in terms of higher incomes. If you do not see citizens or those entering the workforce with either of these three, China, I mean, is a very good example in this regard. It managed to preserve a strong, assertive, authoritarian culture with a single party system, but it had a contract with its citizenry without ensuring much of transparency in many things, through a employment based contract system, which is they will ensure that the citizenry has tangible gains. They will have higher incomes, they will have easier opportunities to rent, get housing, affordable housing, healthcare, and all of those things allowed what you see is never an explosion of revolutionizing resentment. But in any of these other countries that you see right now, whether it was Sri Lanka earlier, then Bangladesh, or Nepal, and I would probably say also sporadic case when you were seeing the citizenship amendment mobilization, a lot of the protesters in India were representing of the Gen Z, women, because anybody who is fueling or understanding that the state at large is not meeting those needs are finding themselves at that unpleasant equation. My reading and understanding is that illiberal structures of governance, if they're not catering to trust and transparency, these protests are not only going to happen more frequently, but the violence in these protests, as you're seeing in Nepal, is going to make things a lot more difficult. And army with the Nepali situation now is it's test of really the army actually, because that's never been tested to its full zenith in containing people since 2001. I mean, since the Royal Palace massacre and then what you've seen. So the democratic structure in the South Asian context, I feel, has now undergone through a very strict litmus test. India is at, I think, a tipping point. We are at no point of time too much away from what we are seeing around ourselves. And as Venu pointed out, corruption, youth unemployment. The third thing which I'll add probably is inflation, which is why I don't anticipate India changing its guard, coming back to the earlier discussion on Russian oil or any oil. It's not about Russian oil, it's cheap oil. The one major trigger of inflation in India is if you are importing oil at higher prices. So food inflation gets affected. The government cannot afford at any cost for inflation to become a major issue, because in UP also, the UP election, combined with unemployment, you also had a huge inflation problem in the last election. So combined effect of these, I think, need to be put in perspective. But it's a very fluid time. I think India, to become more relevant as a country, not just for its own good, but also in South Asia, needs greater integration, political and economic. I think we're becoming at a point a vessel of the Chinese influence in our neighborhood. And with the pivot recently you were seeing with the SEO summit, my understanding is that a closer proximity to China is also not entirely in our interest because of national security exposures. So somewhere I think it's a very difficult tightrope walk for the administration at large.
I have a slightly different view on China because I've written a piece today where at the moment we have 100% of our eggs are in one basket, Indo-US. So some shift towards China is inevitable. Like as I said, 30-40% will go that side. Because on the
You mean
ground,
goods
our
export? You mean goods export to China will go?
no, I'm saying that eggs in broad sense,
Okay.
not just economic interaction. That 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 India will open up. India will go back to the pre-Galwan period, what existed when Modi came to power. China in trade and investment regime, non-discriminatory trade and investment regime towards China. There will be an opening up, which in my view is coming. So, and many businesses have also in last economic survey also said that that India will self-harm if it doesn't open up to big investments from China in future
No,
technologies like EVs.
I think we will differ there,
Yeah.
because I've been teaching and
No, I'm
working on China,
no,
looking
no,
at
I'm
post
talking about
reform.
what the economic survey said.
No, no, economic survey might say, but if you expose China to a lot of foreign capital into across sectors, The only space I can see is in construction, infrastructure, and some of those spaces.
No, but what you're saying
In
is
consumer durables, we
no,
are
no,
already importing a lot of.
No, I'm saying that what you on EVs, we won't get batteries if we don't. So it's the ground realities are different. What you're talking does not correspond to, yeah.
No, so the impact was, so if you would look at the greater exposure of economic relationship with China, we have been the net consumer, and the ability of us to open up where the Chinese consumer are consuming Indian goods is a reality of something which we have not seen. In fact, the Chinese markets across borders are so vigilant about the influx of foreign goods, any goods. I mean, it's not about Indian
But
goods.
you're talking about a static situation.
No, what I'm saying is you want a strategy with the Chinese where whatever
Exactly.
you're already doing
Yeah.
is fair enough. I mean, we are already exposed at a very high ZIL. I think you need some workable solution with the US. But what you really need is your net middle income consumers to import less and consume what is domestically produced. The whole Make in India plan was for Make for India. I think, and that transition has somehow never happened because you are now getting all this capital investment, and Dr. Rajan's point around assembling and many of these things has given you that space. I mean, net resources, natural resources, China has greater comparative advantage. Consumer durables, we don't have that elasticity. Almost in agricultural processing of goods, we have a huge dependence on Chinese imports. Despite that friction and tension, you still have a huge economic dependence.
But I'll tell you what, the policymakers have made one sensible suggestion that instead of importing, why don't we just get investments, joint ventures here and make them here? So at least you reduce the trade deficit with China to that extent.
So that's the Vietnam solution. Actually, the Vietnamese have done exactly.
So I think it's
that.
a perfectly sensible. Yeah, because my point also is that the Indian elites are wedded to Indo-US because they all have connections in the US, bureaucracy, political class. So anything when you talk about China, it creates all kinds of anxieties and fears, which I think some multi-alignment is called for.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time for today. We will continue to follow all of these issues on our website and our YouTube channel. Thank you all for watching, and thank you both for joining me today.